Canada's Transportation Safety Board just released their preliminary report on the aircraft that found itself upside down at Toronto Pearson Airport. This report answers some crucial questions, but some of those answers are in what's left unsaid. But before we talk about the accident sequence and the new revelations, we first need to talk about the flight crew. Much has already been said online about this flight crew, where many of those details have been unconfirmed or even unsubstantiated. Instead, I'm only going to focus on the confirmed details that are found in this report. The captain of this flight had worked for Endeavour Air for almost 18 years, since October 2007. He has accumulated around 3,500 hours of total flight time, including around 750 hours on this aircraft type. While he is a captain on the CRJ, he's also a simulator instructor. Many airlines use professionally built flight simulators to help reduce training costs. These are not the same simulators that you might install at home. This was his first flight in 7 days, although he had worked 3 of those days as an instructor. The first officer wasn't as experienced, as she had only worked for the company for a little over a year. In total, she had just over 1,400 hours of flight time, with about 400 of those on this aircraft type. She had flown every day for the past 5 days and had accumulated around 56 hours in the previous 30. One thing that you'll notice, she had less than 1,500 hours usually required to get into the airlines. There are special provisions for pilots who have taken post-secondary aviation education that allows them to get into the airlines with as little as 1,000 hours. Not all programs qualify, but she had graduated from one that did. When she started flying with Endeavour just over a year ago, she had just surpassed that 1,000 hours. Large airlines like Delta employ a feeder airline system. Before a pilot can fly in a major airline, they're typically required to climb the ranks of a smaller regional airline like Endeavour. As a result, pilots in these regional airlines tend to be less experienced, as the more experienced ones are picked up by the majors. That explains why these pilots were less experienced, but they were definitely not new pilots. But now, let's break down the accident sequence. The plane took off from Minneapolis-St. Paul en route for Toronto, Ontario. The captain was in the left seat with the first officer on the right. The first officer was the pilot flying. That is, they were the pilot with their hands on the controls. The flight was otherwise uneventful right up until the accident. On approach, the pilots calculated the VREF at 139 knots. This is the minimum speed to use while on approach to landing. The company's flight manual for this aircraft requires pilots to fly the final approach at VREF plus another 5 knots. In this case, 144 knots. In gusty wind conditions, they're required to increase that VREF by half the gust factor, not exceeding another 10 knots. At the time, the winds were 28 knots gusting to 35 at 270 degrees true. That's about 7 knots of wind gust, although only 3.5 of that would be straight over the nose. The pilots only set the speed bug to VREF plus 5 or 144 knots. At 500 feet above the ground, the pilot flying disconnected the autopilot. Their airspeed was 150 knots with the ground speed being 121. They were descending at 720 feet per minute with the engines outputting around 64% of N1. This is a fairly normal and stable approach. At 175 feet, they were descending at 672 feet per minute and doing 144 knots airspeed. Around 25 feet lower, the airspeed jumped up again to 154 knots, even though the ground speed didn't change. This is consistent with about a 10-knot wind gust that would increase the performance of the aircraft. The pilot flying then pulled back the throttles, bringing back the N1 from 64% to 43%. This is consistent with the throttles being brought back to idle, where they remained until touchdown. At 50 feet above the ground, the airspeed had settled back to 145 knots, with the ground speed being 112. The ground proximity warning system called out 50, indicating their height above the ground. Alarmingly, their descent rate had increased to 1,114 feet per minute. The plane then called out sink rate, warning the pilots of the extremely high rate of descent. The plane's airspeed had dropped to 136 knots and started to bank to the right. At the moment of impact, the plane is doing 134 knots airspeed and descending at over 1,100 feet per minute. The plane had rolled to 7.5 degrees bank to the right with only 1 degree of nose up. The company's flight operation manual for this aircraft indicates the plane should be flared at 20 to 30 feet above the ground while decreasing the throttle to idle. During this landing, the throttles were brought back to idle at 153 feet above the ground due to the wind gust. It also notes the nose-up attitude should be between 3 and 8 degrees. The final nose-up attitude at impact was only 1 degree. They also define a hard landing as any landing above 600 feet per minute. This landing was almost double that. The main landing gear is designed to take impacts up to 720 feet per minute, but as the plane was in a strong bank, that put all of that energy into a single landing gear. At impact, part of the right main landing gear sheared off, and the main landing gear folded inwards. The right wing spar was bent significantly downwards and fractured at the attachment. As the wing ripped off, The fuel in the wing was scattered and ignited, causing a large fireball. The plane then rolled over to the right from the asymmetric lift and remaining down left landing gear. Amazingly, only 2 people are seriously injured. Many of the other injuries were as a result of passengers removing their seatbelt and crashing into the roof below. With the plane being significantly damaged inside the cabin, it made egress difficult for some occupants. The pilots, for instance, had to escape via the emergency cockpit escape hatch. But that still begs the question, were there any mechanical faults that would hinder the pilot flying? The first thing they checked was the flaps and found that they were fully and adequately extended. They found that the landing gear and tires were in good kit, aside from the damage sustained during landing. They checked all the flight control cables and found that they were free of any pre-existing damage. They even checked the elevator's power control systems and found that there was no faults. The plane's flight data recorder recorded no warnings or cautions for any aircraft control systems. The only pre-existing condition was in the right-hand engine, where its generator was faulty and was ultimately disconnected. But the crew knew this, and to fly legally, they left the auxiliary power unit on for the entire flight. This is a relatively common procedure to maintain power redundancy in the aircraft. The use of the auxiliary power unit is unlikely to be a factor. And that brings me back to the comment I made at the beginning of the video, where some of the answers are provided by the things that are left unsaid. If there were no mechanical faults, and the aircraft was operating as commanded, then the evidence seems to be pointing strongly in one direction. The Transportation Safety Board still has work to do, so we'll await that final report.